Welcome back, family. Before we begin today's story, comment where you're watching from. What you're about to witness is a tale of justice that proves sometimes the most powerful voices come from the most unexpected places. In the austere halls of the Los Angeles Superior Court, Judge Richard Harrison's reputation preceded him. Known for his harsh sentences and barely concealed prejudices, he had earned the nickname the Hammer among the city's public defenders. But on this particular morning, even the Hammer wasn't prepared for what was about to unfold in his courtroom. The case seemed straightforward enough. David Rodriguez, a 19-year-old from East Los Angeles, stood accused of stealing from a local gym. The security footage was grainy, the evidence circumstantial, but Judge Harrison had already made up his mind. You could see it in the way he looked down at David over his reading glasses, in the curl of his lip as he read the boy's prior minor infractions. The courtroom had its usual players that morning. District Attorney James Brooks sat smugly at his table, his expensive suit and carefully styled hair reflecting his ambition more than his commitment to justice. Laura Martinez, the public defender, clutched a worn case file, her determination visible despite the exhaustion in her eyes. David Rodriguez stood straight-backed in his borrowed suit, too big at the shoulders and too short at the wrists. His mother, Maria, sat in the gallery, her hands clasped in prayer, still wearing her housekeeping uniform from her night shift. She hadn't had time to change, coming straight from work to support her son. But there was something different about this morning's proceedings. In the back of the courtroom, a figure sat quietly observing. Jason Statham had come to the courthouse for a different matter entirely, but something about David's case had caught his attention. Judge Harrison began the proceedings with his usual demeanor, barely glancing at the defense table as he shuffled through his papers. "Another one of these," he muttered, loud enough for the first two rows to hear. "Let's make this quick." Laura Martinez stood, her voice clear despite the judge's dismissive tone. "Your Honor, if you'll review the evidence, you'll see that my client was actually at the gym as a legitimate member. He was there as part of a community program helping at-risk youth." Yes, Harrison interrupted, waving his hand dismissively. "I'm familiar with these programs. They give these kids gym memberships, and then we're surprised when things go missing. Continue." The prejudice in his voice was subtle but unmistakable. Patricia Mills, the court reporter who had served in this courthouse for 20 years, felt her fingers pause on her stenotype machine. She had recorded thousands of proceedings, but something about this moment felt different. Detective Michael Walsh, called as the prosecution's first witness, presented the security footage. The grainy video showed someone in a hoodie accessing a locker, but the face was never clearly visible. While we cannot definitively identify the subject, Walsh admitted, the build and clothing matched the defendant's description. District Attorney Brooks rose smoothly, his confidence bordering on arrogance. "Your Honor, the state has established a pattern. The defendant's previous citations, though minor, show a trend toward escalating behavior. We recommend the maximum sentence to send a message." It was then that Jason Statham shifted in his seat, his movement drawing subtle attention. He had been at that gym on the day in question, had seen something that nobody had bothered to investigate. The action star known for his tough guy roles was about to take on his most important fight, this time, in a court of law. Laura Martinez noticed the movement and paused. She had prepared a standard defense, the kind that rarely swayed Judge Harrison. But something in Statham's presence gave her an idea. "Your Honor, I'd like to call a surprise witness if the court would permit." Harrison's eyebrows rose with irritation. "Counselor, you know the rules about surprise witnesses. This isn't some Hollywood drama." The irony of his statement became apparent as Jason Statham stood, his presence commanding immediate attention. The judge's expression shifted from annoyance to confusion as the action star made his way to the front of the courtroom. "Your Honor," Martinez continued, "Mr. Statham was present at the gym on the day in question. His testimony is directly relevant to this case." The courtroom buzzed with whispers. District Attorney Brooks's smug expression faltered slightly. Judge Harrison, for perhaps the first time in his career, seemed unsure of how to proceed. "This is highly irregular," Harrison muttered, but the weight of the eyes upon him, including those of Patricia Mills, whose records would reflect his every word, left him little choice. Very well. Mr. Statham approached the bench. As Jason Statham was sworn in, his presence seemed to fill the courtroom. He wore a simple black suit, but it was his demeanor that commanded attention, calm, focused, and carrying an air of absolute certainty. Maria Rodriguez clutched her housekeeping uniform tighter, hope beginning to replace the fear in her eyes. Her son David stood a little straighter, though his borrowed suit still hung awkwardly on his frame. Mr. Statham, Laura Martinez began, could you please tell the court what you witnessed at Elite Fitness on the afternoon of September 15th? What happened next would change not just the course of this case, but the very atmosphere of Judge Harrison's courtroom. Because sometimes justice needs more than evidence. It needs someone willing to stand up and speak truth to power. The action star's testimony was about to reveal something that would shake Judge Harrison's prejudices to their core. But more importantly, it would remind everyone present that justice shouldn't depend on the clothes you wear or the neighborhood you come from. And there you have it, family. But this is just the beginning of how one unexpected witness would transform not just a young man's fate, but an entire system's perspective on justice. Has anyone ever stood up for you when all hope seemed lost? Share your story in the comments below. The courtroom fell silent as Jason Statham began his testimony. His gravelly voice carried authority that commanded attention from every corner of the room. Even Judge Harrison, who had begun the day with his usual prejudices firmly in place, found himself leaning forward slightly. I was at Elite Fitness that afternoon, Statham began, not for a workout, but to meet with the owner about their youth program. You see, I've been quietly supporting initiatives that give disadvantaged kids access to gyms. It keeps them off the streets, gives them structure. District Attorney Brooks shifted uncomfortably in his seat. This wasn't the direction he had expected the testimony to take. Judge Harrison's expression remained neutral, but his fingers had stopped drumming on his desk, a tell that Patricia Mills, the veteran court reporter, had learned to recognize over the years. I saw David Rodriguez that day, Statham continued. He wasn't stealing, he was stopping a theft. There was another young man, wearing similar clothes, trying to access lockers that weren't his. David confronted him, tried to talk him down. When that didn't work, he physically prevented him from taking anything. The security footage was played again, this time with Statham providing context for the grainy images. What had looked like someone accessing a locker was revealed to be something entirely different. David hadn't been the perpetrator, he had been the hero. The real thief ran off, Statham explained. David stayed behind to report what happened. But when the police arrived, they saw what they expected to see, a young man in a hoodie from East LA standing near an open locker. Detective Michael Walsh, who had testified earlier for the prosecution, had the grace to look uncomfortable. He had followed the obvious leads, made the easy assumptions, never bothering to dig deeper. Laura Martinez seized the moment. Mr. Statham, in your observation, what kind of person is David Rodriguez? Before Statham could answer, District Attorney Brooks jumped to his feet. Objection, Your Honor. Character assessment from a brief encounter is hardly relevant. Judge Harrison, who would normally have sustained such an objection without hesitation, paused. Something was shifting in the courtroom's atmosphere. I'll allow it, he said quietly, surprising even himself. Statham's response was measured but powerful. David Rodriguez is the kind of young man we should be celebrating, not prosecuting. He works part-time to help his mother with bills. He mentors younger kids at the gym, showing them that there are alternatives to street life. He could have walked away that day, but he chose to do the right thing, and he's being punished for it. Maria Rodriguez wiped tears from her eyes as she listened. Her son, who had been carrying the weight of these false accusations for months, stood a little taller with each word. The action star wasn't finished. He turned slightly to address Judge Harrison directly. Your Honor, I've played many roles in my career, but today I'm just someone who witnessed an injustice. This court is about to make a devastating mistake, one that could destroy a young man's future because of assumptions and prejudices. Judge Harrison's face flushed slightly at the implied criticism, but he remained silent. Patricia Mills' fingers flew across her stenotype machine, recording every word of this extraordinary testimony. District Attorney Brooks attempted to regain control during cross-examination. "Mr. Statham, isn't it possible that what you saw was misinterpreted? After all, you're not trained in law enforcement." Statham's response was calm but cutting. "No, but I am trained in something else, reading body language, understanding human nature. It's part of my job. And what I saw that day was a young man choosing to do the right thing, even though he probably knew how it would look." The testimony continued, but something fundamental had changed in the courtroom. The usual power dynamics had shifted. Judge Harrison, who typically ruled his courtroom with unwavering authority, found himself questioning his initial assumptions. Laura Martinez presented additional evidence that had previously been overlooked. Security camera footage from other angles, witness statements that had been dismissed, character references from the gym's staff, all painting a picture very different from the one initially presented. "Your Honor," Statham added, "I've learned in my career that the easy story isn't always the true one. Sometimes you have to look past the surface, past your first impressions, to see what's really happening." The morning wore on, and with each passing moment, the prosecution's case began to unravel. What had seemed like a straightforward case of theft was revealed to be a complex story of prejudice, assumption, and rushed judgment. Detective Walsh requested permission to approach the bench. In a quiet voice, he admitted that certain aspects of the investigation might have been handled too hastily. "In light of Mr. Statham's testimony," he said, "I believe we may need to re-examine our conclusions." Judge Harrison, who had begun the day ready to hand down a harsh sentence, found himself in unfamiliar territory. The certainty that had characterized his previous judgments was eroding in the face of compelling evidence and testimony. Maria Rodriguez watched it all unfold, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She had raised her son to be honest, to stand up for what was right, even when it was difficult. Now, finally, someone was standing up for him. The district attorney made one final attempt to salvage his case. "Your Honor, while Mr. Statham's testimony is interesting, we still have the matter of Mr. Rodriguez's prior citations." It was then that Jason Statham revealed one final piece of information. Those citations? They were for being in the gym after hours. What the records don't show is that David was there helping clean up, earning extra gym time because he couldn't afford a full membership. "I know because I've seen him there, night after night, working hard for something most people take for granted." Judge Harrison removed his reading glasses, a gesture Patricia Mills had seen thousands of times. But today, it seemed less like a prelude to judgment and more like a moment of reflection. The morning's proceedings had exposed more than just the truth about one incident. They had laid bare the prejudices and assumptions that often masqueraded as justice in this courtroom. Laura Martinez gathered her notes, knowing that the tide had turned. But more than winning a case, she had witnessed something remarkable: the power of truth to challenge even the most entrenched biases. As the morning session drew to a close, Jason Statham had one final observation. "Your Honor, in my films, justice usually comes at the end of a fight. But real justice? It comes when we're willing to fight our own prejudices, to look past our assumptions and see the truth." The courtroom fell silent, waiting for Judge Harrison's response. The judge who had earned the nickname, the Hammer, found himself facing a moment of choice, one that would define not just this case, but perhaps his entire approach to justice. And there, in that moment of silence, something profound was happening. It wasn't just about one case or one young man. It was about the very nature of justice itself, and how sometimes it takes an unexpected voice to remind us what that really means. The morning had started with certainty and ended with questions. But they were the right questions, the necessary ones, the kind that force us to examine our assumptions and challenge our biases. As Patricia Mills typed the final words of the morning session, she knew she was recording more than just testimony. She was documenting a moment of transformation, not just for David Rodriguez, but for everyone in that courtroom. As the afternoon session began, something had fundamentally shifted in courtroom 7A. Judge Richard Harrison sat in his chambers during the lunch recess, reviewing his notes from the morning's proceedings. For the first time in years, the Hammer was questioning his approach to justice. Outside in the corridor, word had spread about Jason Statham's testimony. Other judges, lawyers, and court officials had quietly slipped into the gallery to witness what was becoming a landmark moment in the courthouse's history. Among them was Judge Sarah Coleman, who had long disagreed with Harrison's harsh sentencing practices but had never found a way to challenge them directly. The afternoon session began with Detective Michael Walsh requesting permission to provide additional testimony. The veteran police officer, visibly affected by the morning's revelations, had spent his lunch break reviewing the case files. "Your Honor," Walsh began, his voice carrying a note of regret, "in light of Mr. Statham's testimony, I took the liberty of interviewing additional witnesses from Elite Fitness. What I've learned," he paused, glancing at David Rodriguez, "suggests that we may have made serious errors in our initial investigation." Judge Harrison, who normally would have cut off such an irregular procedure, simply nodded for the detective to continue. Patricia Mills noticed how the judge's usual stern expression had been replaced by something more contemplative. Walsh produced new statements from gym staff members, all collaborating David's version of events. Tom Wilson, the night janitor, testified about how David would help clean the gym in exchange for extended hours. Sarah Chen, the membership coordinator, spoke about David's role in mentoring younger members. But it was the security guard's testimony that proved most damning to the prosecution's case. "I saw everything that day," Robert Martinez admitted, "but when the police arrived, they didn't seem interested in my version. They saw what they expected to see." District Attorney Brooks, sensing his case crumbling, attempted to maintain his composure. "Your Honor, while these new testimonies are enlightening, they don't change the fact that Mr. Rodriguez has a history of being in places he shouldn't be." It was then that Jason Statham, still present in the courtroom, requested to approach the bench. Judge Harrison, already far outside his usual protocol, agreed. "Your Honor," Statham said, his voice carrying that familiar gravelly tone but now tinged with passionate conviction, "I'd like to share something about being in places where people think you don't belong. 20 years ago, I was that kid from the wrong side of the tracks. People took one look at me and made their judgments. But someone gave me a chance, saw past the surface, and that made all the difference." The courtroom fell silent. Even the usual shuffling of papers and whispered conversations ceased. Laura Martinez watched as Judge Harrison's expression shifted, recognizing perhaps for the first time the weight of his own prejudices. Maria Rodriguez, still in her housekeeping uniform, stood up slowly. "Your Honor, may I speak?" The request was irregular, but nothing about this day had followed normal procedure. Judge Harrison nodded, his usual brusque manner notably absent. "My son," she began, her voice trembling but growing stronger, "has worked since he was 14 to help our family. When his father left, David became the man of the house. He could have chosen an easier path, but he chose to stay in school, to help others, to make something of himself. The only crime he's guilty of is being born in a neighborhood that people like you have already judged." The truth of her words hung heavy in the air. Patricia Mills' fingers hovered over her stenotype machine, knowing she was recording a moment that would be remembered long after this case was closed. Jason Statham watched as Judge Harrison removed his reading glasses, a gesture that seemed to carry the weight of years of reconsidered judgments. The action star had faced many opponents in his films, but this battle, the fight against prejudice and presumption, felt more significant than any choreographed fight scene. Laura Martinez seized the moment to present additional evidence. Security footage from other cameras showed David actively participating in the gym's youth mentorship program. Letters from community members testified to his character. His school records revealed a student maintaining a 3.8 GPA while working part-time and helping raise his younger siblings. "Your Honor," Martinez said, her voice steady with conviction, "this case is about more than one incident at a gym. It's about how our justice system sees young men like David Rodriguez. Do we see their potential, or do we only see our prejudices?" Judge Harrison sat in uncharacteristic silence, his usual rapid-fire judgments replaced by careful consideration. The courtroom watched as the hammer seemed to wrestle with the weight of his own preconceptions. Detective Walsh, perhaps seeking to make amends for his rushed investigation, presented one final piece of evidence. "We found the actual perpetrator," he announced. He confessed this morning after seeing the news about this case. David Rodriguez was telling the truth all along. The revelation sent murmurs through the courtroom. District Attorney Brooks slumped slightly in his chair, his ambitious prosecution crumbling before his eyes. Jason Statham remained a quiet but powerful presence, his very being a reminder that appearances can be deceiving. The action star who had built a career playing tough guys was now fighting for something more important than box office numbers. He was fighting for justice. Judge Harrison called for a brief recess, retreating to his chambers. Those who had known him for years later reported that they had never seen him so affected by a case. During the recess, something remarkable happened in the courthouse corridors. Other defendants, lawyers, and court officials approached David, sharing their own stories of prejudice and presumption. The young man who had entered the courthouse that morning bearing the weight of false accusations found himself surrounded by support. When Judge Harrison returned to the bench, there was a noticeable change in his demeanor. The stern mask of the hammer had cracked, revealing something more human underneath. "In my years on this bench," he began, his voice carrying an unfamiliar note of humility, "I have prided myself on being firm, on sending messages, on maintaining order. But today, I am reminded that true justice requires more than firmness. It requires wisdom, understanding, and the courage to acknowledge our own biases." Patricia Mill's fingers flew across her stenotype machine, knowing she was recording words that would likely be quoted in law schools for years to come. "What we have witnessed today," Harrison continued, "is not just the unraveling of a false accusation. We have witnessed the unraveling of assumptions that have perhaps guided too many of our judgments. Mr. Statham's intervention, while unusual, has served to remind us that justice must see beyond appearances, beyond prejudices, beyond our own comfortable certainties." The courtroom held its breath as Judge Harrison turned his attention to David Rodriguez. The young man stood straight, his borrowed suit still ill-fitting but his dignity intact. "Young man," Harrison said, "this court owes you more than an apology. We owe you a debt of gratitude. Your actions at the gym that day, and your dignity throughout these proceedings, have taught us all a valuable lesson about judgment and justice." And there, in that moment, something profound was happening. It wasn't just about one case being dismissed or one young man being vindicated. It was about a system beginning to examine its own biases, about justice becoming something more than just the mechanical application of law. The afternoon was drawing to a close, but its impact would resonate far beyond this single case. Sometimes, it takes an unexpected voice, whether it's an action star or a young man in a borrowed suit, to make us question our deepest assumptions about justice, worthiness, and human dignity. The final session of what would become known as the Statham case began with an atmosphere of anticipation. The courtroom was packed, with observers standing along the walls. News of what had transpired had spread throughout the legal community, drawing attorneys, judges, and law students eager to witness this unprecedented moment in the Los Angeles Superior Court. Judge Richard Harrison entered the courtroom, and for the first time in his career, he didn't immediately call for order. Instead, he took a moment to look around the room, his eyes moving from David Rodriguez to Jason Statham, from Maria Rodriguez still in her housekeeping uniform to Patricia Mills at her stenotype machine. "Before I deliver my final ruling," Harrison began, his voice carrying a new note of humility, "I want to address something larger than this single case. Throughout my career, I have prided myself on being firm, on maintaining what I believe to be high standards of justice. Today, I realize that true justice requires more than firmness. It requires the courage to question our own certainties." The courtroom fell into a profound silence as Harrison continued. "Mr. Statham's intervention in this case was unusual, but it has served a purpose far greater than defending one young man. It has forced me, to confront the biases that too often masquerade as judgment." Jason Statham sat quietly, his presence still commanding but now tempered with a sense of satisfaction. The action star who had faced countless adversaries on screen had helped win a different kind of battle, one fought not with fists, but with truth and moral courage. "The case against David Rodriguez," Harrison announced, "is not merely dismissed. It is expunged. But more than that, this court owes Mr. Rodriguez an apology. We allowed prejudice to cloud our judgment, assumptions to override evidence, and bias to threaten a young man's future. Maria Rodriguez wept silently as she listened, her tears now those of joy and vindication rather than fear and despair. Her son, who had carried himself with dignity throughout the ordeal, stood tall in his borrowed suit, no longer bowed by the weight of false accusations. But Judge Harrison wasn't finished. Furthermore, I am announcing the creation of the Rodriguez-Harrison Initiative, a program that will review cases where socioeconomic bias may have influenced judicial decisions. Mr. Rodriguez has agreed to serve on the advisory board, sharing his experience to help prevent similar injustices. The announcement sent a ripple through the courtroom. District Attorney James Brooks, who had pursued the case so aggressively, sat with his head bowed, perhaps confronting his own role in perpetuating systemic biases. Laura Martinez, the public defender who had never lost faith in her client, stood to address the court. Your Honor, in light of this ruling, we would like to present something. The Elite Fitness Youth Program, where this all began, has offered David a full-time position as their youth mentor coordinator. Additionally, they're establishing a scholarship program in his name. Jason Statham chose this moment to stand. If I may, Your Honor, he said, that familiar gravelly voice now carrying a note of determination, I'd like to announce that my foundation will be matching every scholarship dollar for dollar. What happened here today shouldn't be an exception, it should be the beginning of real change. Detective Michael Walsh, who had admitted his hasty judgments in the investigation, approached the bench. Your Honor, the department has authorized me to announce a new training program, focusing on community engagement and bias recognition. We're hoping Mr. Rodriguez will consider speaking to our officers about his experience. The transformation unfolding in Courtroom 7A was about more than one case or one ruling. It was about a system beginning to examine itself, to question long-held assumptions, to recognize the human cost of prejudice. Judge Harrison, the man once known as the Hammer, looked at David Rodriguez with new eyes. Young man, he said, your dignity throughout this ordeal, your commitment to truth, and your willingness to forgive have taught this court more than any law book ever could. You came here seeking justice, but you have helped us understand what justice truly means. Patricia Mills, who had recorded thousands of proceedings in this courtroom, typed with tears in her eyes, knowing she was documenting a moment that would change the course of local judicial history. David finally spoke, his voice steady and clear. Your Honor, my mother always taught me that real strength isn't about fighting back, it's about standing firm in your truth. I'm grateful not just for this ruling, but for the opportunity to help make sure others won't face the same prejudices. Maria Rodriguez stood beside her son, no longer ashamed of her housekeeping uniform but wearing it as a badge of honor, a symbol of the honest work and sacrifice that had shaped a young man of extraordinary character. Jason Statham's final words to the court captured the essence of what had transpired. In my films, justice usually comes through dramatic action. But real justice? It comes through the quiet courage of people like David Rodriguez, through judges willing to question their own beliefs, through communities willing to stand up and say, enough, to prejudice and presumption. As the session concluded, something remarkable happened. The entire courtroom rose, not just out of procedural respect for the judge's exit, but in recognition of a moment of genuine transformation. Judge Harrison, breaking with decades of protocol, stepped down from the bench to shake David's hand. The impact of the day's events rippled outward immediately. Other judges began reviewing their own cases with new eyes. Law schools requested transcripts of the proceedings for their ethics classes. Community organizations reached out to both David and Judge Harrison, seeking their involvement in reform initiatives. But perhaps the most powerful moment came after the formal proceedings ended. In the courthouse corridor, a young public defender approached David with tears in her eyes. I have a client, she said, another young man who reminds me of you. Would you be willing to speak with him? And just like that, the legacy of what had happened in Courtroom 7A began to take shape. It wasn't just about one case or one ruling, it was about changing the way justice sees and serves all its citizens. As people filed out of the courthouse that evening, Jason Statham shared a quiet moment with David and his mother. "You know," he said, "in my movies, I'm usually the hero. But today, you showed us what real heroism looks like. It's about standing in your truth, maintaining your dignity, and helping others even after you've faced injustice." Judge Harrison, watching from his chamber window as people left the courthouse, made a decision that would define the rest of his career. The hammer was retired. Justice, he had learned, required not just a firm hand, but an open heart and a willing mind. And there you have it, family. Sometimes the most powerful changes come not through force, but through the courage to stand firm in truth, the wisdom to acknowledge our biases, and the willingness to create change even after we've faced injustice. Has anyone ever helped you overcome prejudice or false assumptions? Share your story in the comments below.